So yeah, we have had some struggles. Just referencing back to what Adrian said about the importance of audit, and what I'm going to talk about is how to prevent failure in local government. And we have seen a lot of failures in England in recent years. A lot of statutory action by auditors, but also by government departments intervening, the commissioners being sent in, and indeed by finance directors themselves and monitoring officers in councils themselves issuing various reports. So that's been a real problem for us, and I think it shows that perhaps sometimes when the audit regime is not strong and not present and in the moment, it itself can allow some of these things to slip through. So there are very many lessons from England in terms of what not to do and how not to run things, and particularly from an audit point of view. But anyway, that's not the main thing I want to talk about. I wanted to talk about local authorities in England and some of the issues. And on this slide, you'll just sort of see the financial trajectory of English local authorities. Grant Thornton does a lot of analysis of the financial position of local authorities. And I think that's important context for some of the failures that we've identified, because as in all parts of the UK, local authorities are under severe financial pressure. So when people are under severe financial pressure, they can make decisions that, in retrospect, turn out to be unwise in terms of some of the investments they might make and some of the other decisions they make in terms of setting up council companies and trying to do things in a different way, all largely with good intent, but obviously not necessarily well managed, and we'll come on to some of those examples. So this is an important background because some of the decisions that people have made have been driven by the sort of long period of austerity that we've had since 2012. And this is the report that we issued back in December, Preventing Failure. It's obviously available. It's available on our website. So it's not a particularly long report, but I think it's probably quite a helpful report. And the way we decided to go about researching this area was obviously to read the variety of reports that existed around this, but also to work with partners. So we worked with SIPFA, we worked with Society of Local Authority Chief Executives, we worked with lawyers in local government, and we worked with a number of the treasurer societies in England as well. So we convened a number of roundtables, as well as desktop research. We convened a number of roundtables involving all of those organisations to get their perspective of where things have gone wrong in the sector and what needed to be done. So this report is whilst it's a Grant Thornton report, it is informed, very well informed by all of those bodies, and they all had a chance to comment on the draft report and we took account of their findings. And essentially what we are looking at is the issue of organisational failure, where a local authority has failed, and that can be defined in many ways, but when we look at it financially, it's about intervention. It's about where it's a Section 151 officer issuing a 114 report, or effectively banning spend without authorisation, whether it's the monitoring officer saying the council's acted illegally, or whether it's the auditor intervening in some sort of statutory recommendations, or government departments intervening, and particularly the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which has had a rolling approach to sending in commissioners to local authorities where it thinks that they're not being well managed. And that approach has been highly publicised in places like Birmingham, Nottingham, Woking, and Croydon and others. So it is something that is a problem. And one of the important things we identified in our work was that often those people issuing, those finance directors or monitoring officers issuing those reports were effectively calling out the failings of predecessors. Right, so it wasn't that they were presiding over the failure themselves, that they were identifying issues that had been hidden or kept under the surface. And one of the things that we've found really across our research was that often, whether it's audit committee members, council members in general, members were often not very well informed about what was going on. And there's that balance, isn't there, about the sorts of questions that, say, audit committees should be asking versus the sorts of information they should be given, because you can't be all-seeing and all-knowing about everything, can you? So, for example, things like the minimum revenue provision and how that's calculated is quite a complicated local government type specific accounting issue. You can't expect every single audit committee member to have a detailed knowledge of how that works. So you would expect officers to be communicative about, you know, what the rules are and why they set the MRP the way they do. So when we look at some of the causal factors in some of the structures of local authority, we look at the use of council-owned companies. The council-owned companies originally were sort of set up to achieve certain purposes. So, for example, Robin Hood Energy in Nottingham was set up to provide cheaper energy to poorer people in the authority's area. So that was its purpose. But when you set up a company without the right skill set, you're exposing yourself to risk. And we actually did a public interest report on that in 2021. Another thing, and I know this is the thing that CIPFA often talk about, is the role of particularly the chief finance officer. What's their status in the local authority? And it's a long argued point. Obviously, if you look at a corporate structure or even the NHS, the finance director is clearly a board level person, and always has been in those type of structures. In local authorities, they can be quite part of the corporate management team, but they can be in levels below. And whilst there's not always a right answer to this, what we have found is if the finance director has sufficiently not sufficiently high status in the organisation, then they can be ignored, and their sort of siren calls can be not listened to, and that's an important point about status. I know CIPFA would argue very strongly that they should always be at the top table. Obviously, some people argue differently, but what I think we found in England is that where those finance directors were not of sufficient status or experience, some of the things that went on were not called out in an early enough fashion. Local authorities who have had problems with interim statutory officers. One of the issues at Birmingham City Council, which is well publicised and in some of our reports, is they had a sort of rolling sort of level of interims at senior positions. So they've had many chief executives over the past 10 years, many finance directors, many monetary officers. Now, in reality, a council of that size and complexity, you would expect and desire some stability in the top team, and when that doesn't happen, that exposes councils to risk. Combined authorities is a new thing that's been set up in England, and again, too much reliance on interim officers and not enough robustness in financial structures have caused problems there. There's also external factors, and certainly in England, the Department of Levelling Up and Communities has had a massive churn of both civil servants and indeed ministers, so their engagement with the sector and their understanding of the needs of the sector has often been a bit weak. And there's obviously some systemic failures that we see in the local authority world. We talked about audit committees earlier, and internal audit. I think we've seen, again, it's an austerity-driven thing, but sometimes internal audit have been cut back in terms of their resources and the quality of the impact they can have on the system of internal control on local authority can be diminished. We still see some very good, excellent indeed, internal audit functions in local authorities in England, but we also see, especially at some of the smaller authorities, a weakness in internal audit coverage, and that again doesn't help the system control. I talked about commercial expertise. One of the things that we see in these local authority companies, of which there were many set up in England after 2012, where the government effectively said to local authorities, be innovative and entrepreneurial. So many companies were set up, but there was a lack of commercial expertise across a lot of those companies, and they failed because they didn't have that expertise. Again, I mean, I've talked about funding reductions. One of the other oddities, I think, about the local government system in terms of borrowing, as you will be aware, if you're borrowing money from a bank for whatever purpose, there's a whole series of very rigorous due diligence that banks carry out before they lend money to anyone, usually. Access to PWLB funding was, although it's now been tightened up somewhat, was very easy for local authorities, and what we saw on a grand scale in England with low interest rates, local authorities were borrowing from PWLB, and then they were buying investment properties, and they were essentially hoping to make sufficient money on those properties to both pay off the principal and interest and make a profit to generate to their general fund activity. And some of those borrowings were completely disproportionate to the size of the local authority. And two councils in England that were particularly noticeable for this were Spelthorpe Council and Woking Council, where very small councils with very small net revenue spend in and around the £20 million mark, so that was their annual spend, and yet they were borrowing up to £1 billion to buy investment properties, sometimes funneled through companies. And so the question is both why did they do that and what was the oversight of that, but also why was the Treasury lending money to a very small council at that level, because all that money did come from Treasury. And the other thing that just on that is about sort of the regulation of the local audit system. And clearly in England we did for many years have the Audit Commission, and the Audit Commission had a rigorous approach to dealing with challenges in local authorities. So if it had matters it was concerned about, it asked all auditors to go away and look at them. You know, things like investment in Icelandic banks back in 2008, and a whole range of other areas where the Commission had directed auditors, whether they were their in-house team or the firms, to go and look at these particular areas. Well, that fell away with the abolition of the Commission. So you had a system without leadership. There was no sort of essential leadership in the audit system. So the audit firms, who by then were doing all of the work, were sort of just following audited standards and not really following risk in particular local authorities that wasn't related to the accounts. And that's a big issue, and that's been partly why we've got the problems we've got. So we didn't have the leadership that you need to when you're auditing on a sort of national scale like that. So that caused us a major problem, and meant that where some of these things were happening in the local authorities, there wasn't an auditor saying, excuse me, what's he doing? And that's really important. I think the other thing that we've identified in terms of what's caused failure is weak leadership, inexperienced leadership, turnover of senior officers, as I was saying, and some of those factors are also about behaviour. And I think, and I've had a long career in audit in England, and the behaviour of some people in local authorities has deteriorated over the past 20 years or so. I think behaviour both in terms of doing the right thing, understanding the importance of the public purse. I mean, Adrian talked about fraud and waste, and you can imagine the impact these scandals have had on the public perception of local authorities in England. Not very positive, as you might imagine. I mean, if you're a resident of Croydon, you had to have a 15% council tax rise for 23-4. You know, that's not really making the public feel particularly endeared to their council. So some of the behaviour of officers, some of the behaviours of some council leaders, and the lack of transparency and oversight has led to some of these problems happening. So there's been another thing that's really slightly odd is, and from an audit point of view, you find this difficult to understand, is that when local authorities are embarking on major transformation projects or major investments, they will spend a lot of money on lawyers, huge amounts of money on lawyers, but very little money on accounting advice about how to account for schemes. And so what we've found on many occasions is that the council has failed to sort of basically treated something as off balance sheet when it should be on balance sheet because they haven't taken proper accounting advice, having spent millions on lawyers to bring a scheme into fruition. So that's a piece of advice we'd always say. We'd always expect local authorities that were developing arrangements, lease and lease back, and other type of things, to make sure the accounting advice they get is robust and sustainable, can stand up to audit scrutiny. The other thing that has led to failures is the lack of a consistent voice. I mean, the LGA speaks consistently, I think reasonably consistently, on a sort of political level to government, but obviously on funding and some of the financial issues, local authorities have not always. There's been a degree of playoff between different types of local authorities that has caused a bit of a concern, to be honest. So the system in England is not working very well at the moment and has led to some of these failures. In terms of the things we identified as good practice, the importance of members having full oversight of key council decisions, the importance of the auditor being able to report to all members. That was something that was very traditionally the case in England in the past, and it would be often the case that the district auditor would come along to an annual council meeting and give his or her view of the world. That had fallen away, and so members were often in the dark about what the auditor was saying, because although audit committees would have heard auditor views, it didn't always necessarily filter out to all members. So I think it's really important that all members have a full understanding of what the auditor is saying about their organisation. Making sure that executive officers, the senior officer team, have the right competencies and skills, that they have their own CPD programme, they have mentoring, etc. if they're new to role. It's a really important part of the process to us. Obviously, overview and scrutiny functions are really important in councils. We see some that are overly political and don't really work effectively. And audit committee itself, the audit committee's role is incredibly important because it can galvanise action in the organisation. It obviously has internal audit and external audit reporting to it. And what we found at those councils where the failures have been identified is the audit committees were quite often quite weak. So, for example, Croydon's audit committee was very political in nature, and so what they decided to do as part of their recovery is to appoint an independent chair of that audit committee. So he's not a member; he's just an independent chair, but obviously has the same sort of broad political makeup as committees you'd expect committees to have. But with that chair, the tone of the meetings, the scrutiny in the questions, the apolitical nature of the questions has really improved. And so that's a good example of making sure that your audit committee arrangements are robust and that enables good scrutiny and challenge. These are just some of the things we think are really important in terms of these roles. As I said, CPD's incredibly important, mentoring is incredibly important. One of the things we've found in England with the treasurers' societies that exist, that if people that regularly attend those events get really good insight from their colleagues or from wider organisations about the issues facing local government, and it's often at other organisations where people that aren't part of a broader community, where a community like this, for example, where issues come up and things are not managed effectively in places. So those communities are really important. Internal audit's incredibly important from our perspective. A strong internal audit, a well-invested internal audit with good skills, with IT skills and the ability to buy in additional IT skills for complicated areas such as cyber security. That's incredibly important. Fraud, internal audit function. We see some very good sort of counter-fraud teams in local authorities, but we see in some cases where the authority doesn't have one. So that's really an important area where there's robustness about that approach, because that provides a deterrent as well across the organisation. the monitoring officer, the chief legal officer. Again, what we found in some cases, some really strong monitoring officers who say to members, no, you can't do that. If you do that, I will write a Section 5 report. And to others who just seem to nod stuff through. So that role is incredibly important in terms of councils complying with the law. Obviously, these bodies are all incredibly important in terms of their role. That obviously the National Audit Office has a sort of broader oversight role on the system in England, and all of these other bodies have an important role, and we've sort of flagged up in the report as a key recommendation. Obviously, HMT have now looked at the PWL borrowing, and it's a lot stronger than it was. One of the things we talked about at Grant Thornton for a while was the implementation of the Redmond Review. And the Redmond Review was carried out to review the challenges in the local audit system in England, and the Redmond Review wanted an oversight body, an independent oversight body to regulate the audit system. That hasn't happened yet in England, but that's something that we as a firm think is really important. And I think, in general terms, although obviously this report has been about where things have gone wrong, I mean, the majority of local authorities in England are still relatively well run and well managed. So it's just about trying to ensure that good practice is shared, that where failure, or the risk of failure starts to bubble up, that it's dealt with quickly, and that people take appropriate advice, and peer learning, and all of those things are really important. And that professionals understand each other's role, and that the monitoring officer, Section 151 officer, and the chief executive have a shared understanding and vision of what's right in a local authority, and are able to articulate that to members. I've worked with one particular local authority that has lots of challenges, but the chief executive and the monitoring officer and the finance director are in sync about how they deal with issues and how they require members to follow the law and to put procedures in place to ensure financial sustainability. So that's a really important part of that role. So they're key. We're going to publish a new report on financial sustainability and preventing failure, hopefully next month, but maybe slightly later than that. And we've issued a number of different reports, which are all available on our website, all looking at some of the key issues in local government as we see them in the last year or so. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has.